Good morning, everybody. It's wonderful to see all these lovely faces coming from around the world, and welcome from the bottom of our warm hearts in this very cold day. It's great to have you all here. May I ask first if all these busy leaders have cell phones and pagers and so forth to please turn them off so that we can have uninterrupted and quiet time. We are here today, organized in this symposium by Women's Learning Partnership. My name is Mahnaz Afkhami, and I represent the network Women's Learning Partnership. We are grateful to UNFPA, who has been supporting this conference both in terms of resources and in terms of cultural and inspirational resources. We share a lot of ideas and strategies with that organization. The title of our symposium today is Leading to Change, Eliminating Violence Against Women in Muslim Societies. And in this time of re-evaluation, redefinition, rethinking, re-examination that we are right now in the midst of, 10 years after Beijing, violence seems a very appropriate topic to focus upon. Why? Because violence in all its egregious forms is probably the most terrible breach of human rights that we face today. Also because it is connected to every other area of the 12 areas of focus of the Beijing Platform for Action. One could point especially to empowerment, which is the bedrock of all the changes that we wish to bring about, because after all, violence and power seem to be very closely connected. Violence being really one of the causes that is powerlessness being one of the main causes of violence of all sorts. And one of the other reasons is violence is something that pervades our lives across the world, from the small places that are supposed to be our safe haven in the home, to the streets of our cities, to the alleys of our villages. Women are facing various forms of violence. And then, of course, when men go to war, whole communities of women seem to be affected, seem to be targeted by violence. So it seems that in order to gauge where we have come in the last 10 years post-Beijing, one of the areas which is a great indicator is what is the status of violence against women, especially since it's been a point of focus for a wide variety of declarations, conventions, agreements by the international community. At least 10 of them really specifically focus on violence and how to eradicate it. Now, why are we talking about Muslim societies when we all know that violence pervades life everywhere across the world, and that it is prevalent in every ethnic, geographic, class, age, all these lines are crossed when we come to violence. One of the reasons is that we happen to be, as women living in Muslim societies, at a particular historical moment in our life, which is an interesting moment. On the one hand, we are witnessing a resurgence of extremism, although again in that we are not alone. This country itself, for instance, is one of the places where extremism seems to be quite prevalent. But someone says here even worse. But also because at the same time that this extremism, and we all are familiar with the many causes of it, from poverty to lack of choice to hopelessness to overzealous interpretations, wrong-headed interpretations of religion and culture, and so on and so forth. But along with this re-emergence and strengthening of extremism, there is also this extraordinary movement that is happening in these societies. The movement spearheaded by women, but concentrating on full participation of everybody in decisions that affect their lives, building of strong civic societies, changing and reforming legislation. This is a movement that I think is probably one of the most hopeful signs in the world. The kind of organization and the kind of campaigns that are being born and being animated and energized in Muslim majority countries. And one of the characteristics of these movements is a rethinking of the cultural basis of human relationships. Now, again, here we are all aware, I'm sure, of the fact that across the world, the problem that women have faced has been the problem of culture. Because some people in the West seem to think that culture is something colorful that happens somewhere else, that we just don't have it anywhere else. But whether it's West, South, East, or North, culture is the place where human relations take form. Culture is our way of relating to our environment based on the facts, based on the experiences that we have in that interaction between the individual, the community, and the general social environment. And the culture that we have all faced across the ages is the culture of patriarchy, which has had a way of defining where women are, no matter where you are, whether you're in Sweden or whether you're in Zimbabwe or Kuwait. Throughout history, we have always had a very similar place. There have been different images reflecting that and different surface ways of expressing it, but the essential characteristics have been very much the same. That is, always the woman has had a special place as complementary to the shakers and movers of the world who have been men. Always the woman has needed some sort of a guardian, and she has not been able to be guardian to her children or to her family. Choices of job, choices of political office, choices of even place of residence, let alone control over one's body, have been really very similarly organized throughout the world. And we have to remember that it was only the beginning of the past century where women got the right to even say something in the political process, to have a role in the political process. And it took a place like Switzerland until 1970 to give the franchise to women. So this is just to point out that we're fighting really the same condition, the same context. And wherever change has happened, the change has had to happen culturally. That is, the culture of patriarchy has had to change, and all of its ramifications in various ways of the various phases of patriarchy have had to change, and so that is something that we need to look at as we look at culture change in Muslim societies. Now, of course, in Muslim majority societies, this is happening in a both in some ways more clear-cut way and in some ways in a more complex way. The clear-cut being the sharp and very vivid categorization of rights versus traditional and extremist interpretations. But the complexity comes from the fact that women are also fighting outward attacks, outward stereotyping, outward being pushed into specific definitions of themselves that they have to deal with. That is, you have to both deal with an internal process that is threatening and difficult to deal with, but at the same time you have to negotiate what the outside says and does in relation to you. So how do you negotiate this? How do you bridge your need to be an independent, free woman, participating in your society, participating in decisions everywhere from the family up to the society, but at the same time not lose touch with your culture, with your roots, with your religion, with whatever gives meaning to your life. So this bridging is the complex thing, and of course we have been kept out of discussions of religion and culture, especially religion. We've been kept out of schools and education that gives credibility to our statements when we want to reinterpret our faith, where we want to re-examine the role of women. We have been kept out of the knowledge, the epistemological process that gives credibility to our exercise. But now for the first time really in recent times, that people are trying to do this, trying to rethink and reimagine and reread the text in a positive way and to use the text as a resource. Again, here, across the Abrahamic religions, we have the same problem. It's not Islam that is specifically oppressive to women, although there are oppressive things in Islam which have been used to bring about some of the most oppressive laws that can be used in terms of regulating women's lives. But others have the same thing. And everywhere change has had to happen change in interpretation and in reading has had to happen in order to bring about a better life. Just a quick reminder is that about both the inside-outside kind of developments, the external forces, internal forces. It's interesting to look back to the early part of the 20th century when fundamentalism was resurgent, especially in the United States. And of course there were a lot of forces of change in Europe, especially in England. Suffragettes were doing all sorts of things. They were marching, they were opposing, they were acting, and so forth. And then the fundamentalists in the United States were writing about this and reacting to it. And I just want to read you a few lines from one reaction and see how familiar that sounds. Again, there is an external force of change coming from Europe. There is an internal trying to stay the way they are and to resist the force of change here in the United States. So this is the statement in one of the journals of the time. This is early 1920s. The situation in England is serious. These satanic instruments seem to stop short of nothing. Like their master, who is a murderer, that's Satan, from the beginning, they may resort to poison and destroy human life. It is significant how Satan uses women. He goads them on to perpetrate these wicked actions. Woe unto this world when they get the leadership they desire. So this is the kind of thing that happens. You see the same kind of internal, external kind of relationship at that time between Europe and the United States, and at this time between the West and the developing world, and this sort of name-calling and strong reaction that is shown to any change in women's status. Now, today we are privileged to have some of the most thoughtful and significant voices with regards to the projects of elimination of violence against women in the world. I will just describe to you how the day will work, and I hope that you can be with us, even though a lot of exciting things are happening elsewhere in this building and across the street. What we're going to have is a 3-session day. The first session will begin, I'm hoping, with Noeleen Heyzer, who's supposed to be here any minute now. She will be, as you know, she is the director of UNIFEM, and UNIFEM has done a lot of work on violence against women, both in terms of its trust fund, specifically on violence, and in terms of empowerment of women. Noeleen will talk about overview of the global situation vis-à-vis violence. Then we have our good friend Ayesha Imam, who is the Chief of Culture, Gender and Human Rights at the UNFPA. And Ayesha, of course, is one of WLP's original partners with Baobab, whose other representatives are here in the room. Cindy, I see here. I think Bonmi might be here somewhere also. Ayesha will be talking about culture and fundamentalism and how violence and programs on elimination of violence have to be negotiated vis-à-vis various cultural and traditional practices and beliefs. And then we'll have Sakena Yacoobi from AIL, another strong partner of WLP, who will talk about post-conflict situation in Afghanistan and how various aspects of violence have demonstrated themselves in that country. Asma Khadra was our last speaker. Asma is one of the, she unfortunately won't be here. She personifies one of WLP's dilemmas. We try to get our partners, our group, to move up in the leadership ladder and get to the positions, get to the table where they make decisions. So 4 of our partners have started as individual activists, have gone into NGO leadership and have gone into government as ministers. But what happens then is that they become completely, tied up with whatever governmental limitations there is. So we have this love-hate relationship with trying to push them up, but at the same time hold on to them, which is important. But it also presents us with the situation where we need to get our people in those places, but we need to both give them support and connect to them so that we don't lose them to the forces of the situation as is. We will have a lot of Q&A, I hope, because this is a very sophisticated, knowledgeable group here, and we want to hear from everyone as much as we can. And we will have a lunch break at 12:30 to 1:30, followed by the panel on the international perspectives, where Yakin Ertürk, we're very proud to have her here with us. She's come a long way and is going to far places after this. But she will share with us her perspectives, and especially will tell us where the governmental situation is vis-à-vis violence, and where the hopeful signs are, as well as the challenges. And then we will have Hilary Fisher from Amnesty International, who's doing a great advocacy campaign on violence, and she will give us the non-governmental perspectives. Followed by Charlotte Bunch, who will talk about the war on terror in this country and the kind of terror that it has brought about for a lot of us civil society workers, and also the implications that it has had abroad. And then last but not least on that panel is Devaki Jain, whose wonderful new book on the history of the UN has just come out, and I hope you'll all get this is the women's part of the history of the UN, and I'll give you the exact title and where to get it later on. Devaki will talk about, she's an economist, and she's got a lot of experience in every aspect of activism, but she will concentrate on poverty and violence for us. And in the last panel, we will talk about power and violence and the relationship between the two. And we will have Hafsat Abiola, who's just come from Nigeria and has been at the institute which Baobab has organized with WLP on training of trainers there. And so Hafsat will give us her perspective from that vantage point. And then Rabia Nasiri and Amina Lemrini from Morocco will tell us about the Moroccan efforts in changing the various legislation that affects violence against women, followed by Zaina Anwar from Malaysia, who comes from a very warm place and is very cold, but we'll have to make her feel warm here. She will be talking. She's from Sisters in Islam and has been very active in creating the legislation in Malaysia against violence, and she will talk about the implementation and awareness raising that have come about since and what needs to be done after that. And I hope we will close the day with some real understanding, expanded understanding of both the challenges and the new strategies that we have ahead of us in terms of violence, and we will hear about some of the various improvements in this area that have been done and have been achieved by this collective action. And I want to say that I usually don't quote men, but this very smart man Einstein once said that you cannot solve same problems with the same people who have helped create those problems. You need new voices and new people in order to make a difference. So we have here new voices and new people in the world, in the global scene, and I'm sure that together we will be able to begin at least a new set of strategies that are appropriate for the challenges of the 21st century. So thank you all for being here. It doesn't seem that Noeleen has gotten to us yet. Is Noeleen here? Okay, why don't we start with you, Ayesha, then, and then go on to Noeleen. We can do that. The only problem, Ayesha, is that they won't see everybody anyway. But let's do it. Yeah. Okay, Sakena, would you like to come up and sit to keep Ayesha company? Okay. You want me to keep Noeleen's seat warm? Thank you very much. Thank you, Ayesha, for that wonderful statement. Noeleen has joined us, but I think that she needs to catch her breath. So what we'll do is maybe have Sakena Yacoobi have her presentation, and then we will go back to Noeleen, who will then both have her presentation and chair the Q&A session as well. We haven't been giving full introduction of the speakers because, as you have seen, those introductions are in the program. So in order to just leave more time for Q&A, we'll just skip the backgrounds of these splendid women. Sakena is president of AIL, and I'll leave it at that, a very effective, dynamic organization for women in Afghanistan and a partner of WLP. Sakena.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you. You are all welcome, and I am so happy to be amongst all of the smart, intelligent women who are going to bring change in the world, and who can bring if there is not a woman. I think we are in the right place, and thank you for joining us here. I would like to talk a little bit about Afghanistan, because I know as soon as you see the name Afghanistan, everybody has an image of Bukle, Taliban, woman is not able to work, woman is not able to get outside their house. So I am sure these are all in people's mind. So since that is in everyone's mind, let's talk about that, how we are dealing with it and what happened to our society. As you all know, in Afghanistan for 27 years have been war by Russian, by civil war between different Mujahideen group and Taliban. And you know that when the country ran to in the war situation, the first victim in every nation is women and children. And that happened to Afghanistan. Women and children were the victim of war. And when you are a victim of war, you could imagine what happened to the women who have been already denied their right. Because we are a Muslim society. We are in a Muslim society. Already our rights has been denied. Already we have been abused. Already we are a victim of a kind of things that we will never be able to speak in our husband or our brother or our father. Once the war is happened, then of course the first person who is going to sacrifice is the woman, because anybody is frustrating, anybody who has a problem, is the first thing we do, they will take out of women and children. Yes, all these things happen to Afghanistan, and how we are going to go about it and change it. We must change it. And in order for that to change the situation, I think that the first thing we do, we educate women. Because as you know, if you have a right educational system and you educate the women, they can speak. As our colleagues talk about it, that we cannot be a silence. If we want to not be a silence, we must answer how to answer in a right way. Culture sensitive, through tradition, and through religion. We must be aware of all these three areas in order to not be silenced. And if we are not aware of it, then we could not answer, we could not respond, because then we will be ignored, and also we will be accused of not having enough knowledge why we are talking about. So the first thing we pinpoint, we go through education. We educate the women. And when we educate the women, they must want the education. They have to come to us. They have to come to us and ask the education, and we provide for them, and that's the way that we can be successful. As some of our colleagues says, we must be very innovative. We must be creative. How to bring the change through education? What we do when we bring the change through a creativity? Afghan Institute of Learning opened Women Learning Center. We were the first women organization who started Women Learning Center in Peshawar, Pakistan, in the refugee camp. What was the purpose of this Women Learning Center? This Women Learning Center was the area that the women come, gather together and sit and discuss different issues. Their family issue, their economical issue, their physical issue, their mental issue. All kinds of this issue could come in that Women Learning Center and we be discussed. So what we did, we taught them human rights workshop. What is human rights workshop? If we said we are talking about human rights, we will be right away, we will be put in jail, we will be all kinds of punishment we will face. But we said we are educating women about their rights according to Islam. You know, in this part of the world, everybody is attacking Islam. Islam did that, Islam is doing that, Islam is doing that. But nobody is aware that Islam is a religion that gives women all kinds of rights. I think really to tell you, from any other religion, Islam is the religion is that more free, more democracy, and gives lots of right to women. But if the interpretation of Islam is correct, but if the interpretation of Islam is not correct, then that can be used as a PowerPoint. Everybody could interpret it in the wrong way and sit in the chair and said, Islam said this, Islam said that, Islam said that. But once we know what is Quran says, once we know that the heritage law, which is giving to everybody equal, is in Quran. A marriage law is in Quran. Democracy is in Quran. Gaining knowledge for men and women equal is in Quran. We must know how to interpret them. And we as a woman must go about it and interpret it right. If we are sitting there and listening to our brother or husband or uncle to they interpret for us, we are not going to get anywhere. We must interpret the Quran according to Quran, because Quran is a book that if we follow it according to the law of Sharia, it will be directing all of us to democracy, to human's right, to women's right, every one of those issues that today we are claiming through philosopher, through writer, through educator, all those are in Quran. And so the best way to attack that, to read Quran and teach those people to read Quran and interpret for themselves. Once they learn how to read those and interpret it for themselves, we were successful. I just want to talk to you about AIL. I am sure since Beijing +5, a lot of change happened to the world, to the women, especially an Afghan women. A lot of Afghan women is speaking now. They are speaking very clearly and very loud. Yes, we are facing a lot of problem, but we are not sitting quiet, because a lot of chances available for us. We are gaining news from the world through the internet. We are communicating with different NGO, different organizations. We are getting linkage with different countries. So we are aware of what's going on around the world and how we are going to bring this to our country and to bring it to our people and make sure that everyone gets the advantage of it, not just only the elite group, not only the person who is going abroad. Through the community, through the village, people get that. As you know, in every community, the people who suffer the most are the poor, because they are suffering not only for economical changes, because they don't have the means, but also they are suffering culture, tradition, religion, because the first thing that they put on them, they must suffer the most. So what we should do, we should bring this education to the village and the level of those poor people that they are there and help them to understand that they have a voice, they have a right. And that's happened to Afghan Institute of Learning. We went to the community, we distribute this Women Learning Center in all villages in a rural area of Afghanistan, in different provinces, and also in the refugee camp. As a result, we created a group of women who are right now love to learn. They are going to the literacy program. They are learning how to read and write. They are changing their life. If this change is enough, it's not enough, because we have a long way to go. They are sitting side by side with their children and with their grandchildren. They are learning. We are trying to empower women. Empower women by education and by economical means. You know that if a woman is secure and have means of economy, if they are able to support themselves, they will be able to speak out, because they will not be abused. They will have a voice. The first thing that brings security in Afghanistan, I think that economy is most important, and education is the base for it. Once you educate the women, they can bring their skill to their home, they can support their family, and they will have a voice. If they don't have a skill, if they could not support their family, they will not be able to be here, because the men will say, I am supporting you, I am providing, you have nothing to say. Forget about that. And the poor woman should stay quiet, cannot say anything. But if the woman is the breadwinner, if the woman goes outside and work, if the women are educated, the women are more than half of the population of Afghanistan, as you know. And today, most of the women are the head of the household, because we lost lots of men. There are not that much men around. But the men who are around, they are uncle and brother, they are controlling their life. So they need to be independent, they need to have a skill. So when we bring a change in Afghanistan, if we educate the society, and that's AIL are about. We are a women organization. We are running about 350,000 women and children getting support from our organization, all in area of health and education, because we believe strongly that if a mother is healthy, if a mother knows about reproductive health, if a mother knows how to protect herself from getting pregnant, from having too many children, also she will be able to speak out. Also she will be able to reach for herself. If she is not able to do that, constantly she has children, she is sick, she is not educated, she will not be able to speak. She has to be silenced. She has no choice. So for that reason, I really believe that education is the key. Education is the key for women's change, for violence to not be there. Violence in every family. When we go to the Women's Center, we talk to those people. They have been abused by their brother, by their father, by their neighbor, by everybody. Of course, during the Taliban, there's every one of you knows about it, how much the women were abused. Violence against women everywhere in the corner of Afghanistan. But this violence must be stopped. And the only way that can be stopped, that the women answer, not silence, with voice. Tell them that Quran says that, law said that, Sharia said that, and according to that, we can do what we want to do. And Afghanistan needs security. Right now in Afghanistan, yes, we have a government, and you know that 4 million women stand up on the voting post and they vote. So that's a big change for us. We really are proud of that. I think the women of Afghanistan needs credit here. I think they were brave, they have been wonderful, they stand up there, and the women could not go in that poll, and the women of Afghanistan went in that poll, and they did vote, because they are tired of this kind of violence. They are tired of this abuse. But that's not enough. Right now in Afghanistan, the capital country, the Kabul is safe. But if you want to go to other province, it's not safe for Afghan women. They must go with somebody else. They cannot travel alone. Still, there is a lot of problem, but we really need to educate the Afghan women that they be able to speak out for themselves. And through what kind of education? Through a culture sensitivity, through a tradition, through a religion that told us that we have this freedom. Example, a lot of people in Afghanistan, they are against education. Why? Because when the Russian invaded Afghanistan, people blamed the Russian invasion of Afghanistan on education, because they thought that these people brought a system that it wasn't acceptable in our country. And that's the reason that Russian invaded Afghanistan. And when the Mujahideen were fighting, also they were fighting according to Islam, this and that. And also the Taliban did that. So people are really suspicious. When they go to learn, they really want to learn the way they want to learn. We must be very creative to find out how we can provide the service for those people that it will not, they will not resent it, but it will be acceptable in that society. And that we must to bring in the community a very sensitive, very culturally related kind of a educational system that will not be threat to them, but at the same time help them to learn, to have a voice. And that's Afghan Institute of Learning is doing. And I would love to stand up and talk about this so much. But I want to tell you one case study that a girl in Afghanistan in a refugee camp came to our Women Learning Center. She was a girl that she was 14 years old. She was married because her uncle gave her to somebody to marry. She didn't have a father. She lost her father. She came to the center after she lost her husband. She had a husband for 4 years, and then the husband ran away with another woman. So here she is in Pakistan. She doesn't have any family. She is in an area that she is completely alone by herself, and she don't know what to do. So she, through the word of mouth, she find out about our center. She came to our center, and we help her, of course, psychologically, of course, socially, of course, economically. We try to work with her. And do you know that she went through the literacy program, she learned a skill, now she is back in Afghanistan. She find a way to go back to Afghanistan, she joined her family, and now she is one of our literacy teacher in our program. That's the way we go about change. And that is, I call it change. And that a person who were abused, a person who didn't have education, a person who could not do anything, from one country to another country was taken away and returned back to Afghanistan by herself and joining her family, and right now supporting her mother and 4 of her brother and sister because she doesn't have the father. This kind of a program that we provide, and that is the way we go about the change. Thank you very much. And if you have questions, please.
Thank you, Sakena. I just wanted to also bring out that there's been a lot of talk of Islam as religion and relationship between Islam and rights. But we have to remember, I think, that what we're talking about is religion, Islam being one of them, as resources for one of the resources for women's empowerment. We have to remember that most societies, and Muslim societies are no exception, are extraordinarily diverse, and they contain a lot of members of various religions. So what we would like is an environment in which all religions in every society has a possibility of expressing itself, of being believed in and being practiced freely and safely. So questions of religious belief and questions of civic law are, one would say, two parallel areas of activity that can enrich each other, but at the same time, I think if we're going to push for full rights for everybody, we have to remember that no one religion is to be dictating to other religions in a society, and we all need to have that awareness. That was just adding to what we have all been saying this morning. And now I wanted to ask Noeleen to address us. Noeleen has been a great friend and supporter of myself and WLP for a long time, and she has been a leading voice really in every area of women's activism, but most specifically, I think, in the area of violence, where the trust fund, the UNIFEM's trust fund, has done such innovative and important work. And again, everyone knows Noeleen, and her short bio is in the program, so I won't say any more, except that I'm very happy to have you here, Noeleen, and please come to the podium.
Very good morning, everyone, and my apologies for coming in late. I haven't learned how to be in two places at the same time. But Mahnaz, I couldn't resist. I have to be here, and not just to support you, but because the work that you do is just so important, but also because this is so timely to put an issue of culture, conflict, and extremism on the agenda as we look at the Beijing Plus 10 is so extremely important. So I want to congratulate you for organizing this meeting, Mahnaz, and for your leadership and for your friendship always. It's also such a wonderful pleasure to be in the same panel as Ayesha and Sakena. So thank you very, very much. And I was so pleased to be able to hear you, and a big welcome, everyone. I wanted to take us, because the title of today's session is Culture, Conflict, and Extremism. And you've heard about religion, you've heard about culture in that context. But I want to take us a little bit away from that and to talk about the culture of war, and also the culture of impunity, and the economics of what actually fuel that kind of a culture. And also to say that as we have been working for so many years on ending violence in women's lives, but it's really like walking up the down escalator. Every time when we think we have made tremendous stride, the world seems to be getting more and more violent. It's getting more and more extreme in the context of the war on terrorism and the war on terrorism, and how sexual violence has been used as a tool even there. And it is extremely important for us to rethink what all this means. We have worked for a very long while as the Women's Fund of the UN in the context of war and conflict and post-conflict reconstruction. What is extremely clear to us, and that was why we brought about a Security Council Resolution 1325, was the impact of war and crisis on women's lives. And as you've heard me said many times, those of you who have heard me speak, is that violence against women is not just a personal devastation anymore. It's become such a tool. It's become such a tool of war, not just to destroy women, but women have been basically the tool to destroy communities, to destroy the future. In other words, it's just a humiliation. It's not just a humiliation of women, but it's a humiliation of the men, it's a humiliation of the community. It makes it so difficult to revitalize community structures. And yet, sexual violence, the kind of rape, the kind of violation that I have seen, is always regarded as a secondary crime. There's not enough evidence. How do you make sure it is addressed in a particular way? How do you get hard evidence? And so on. It is not taken seriously enough, even in our justice culture. And therefore, the culture of impunity, it's so difficult because of the way the rule of law works, because of the institutions of the rule of law, and also the fact that the rule of law institutions themselves are not gender sensitive. And therefore, what we are really dealing with, whether we're talking about religion or talking about war, talking about even economic culture of the way we have tried to commoditize women's bodies in the economic culture, the way media has used the issue, or the way media has portrayed women's bodies and so on, we're really talking about patriarchal culture. Let's face it. And therefore, the issue of power and how that is being used to define how we treat women has to be addressed if we're going to break the issue of inequality and to change culture so that it can empower women in the true sense of the word. And I just would like to say that I have seen so many women who have tried to seek justice, but especially in situations after post-conflict. But I'm very sorry to say that very often justice is sacrificed at the peace table. Now, what do I mean by that? Because we've always said we want women at the peace table. What it means is that again, the culture of in the patriarchal situation, how peace is seen is negotiated with warlords. Right? And therefore, when you come to the peace table, what gets negotiated are political power positions for the militias. And you find that those who have violated women are rewarded by strong power positions, political positions in many of the countries. And women are sacrificed in that process. And therefore, it is so important for us to make sure that whilst the court systems are not operating well, both at international level and even some the local level, that at least we do not reward the culture of impunity. And at least through political rewards. And at least we change that culture by turning this whole issue on its head, by making sure that women get to the peace table, making sure that women participate politically, women get addressed economically in terms of economic security. So what does gender justice look like in that situation? Gender justice for me consists of 3 parts. The culture of justice for women. So what if we turn all that around, what does the culture from the perspective of women's empowerment and gender equality looks like? Firstly, what I call the issue of restorative justice. That we need to recognize the violation that has taken place of women and get that addressed. We need to address legal justice, that at least in all the frameworks of laws, of constitutions, women rights get put right and center. And there is an issue of state accountability. It is no longer an individual community issue. It is no longer an issue of faith-based culture. It is state accountability. There are duty bearers, basically. And there are right claimers. Those who have been violated have rights to claim accountability. So the culture of accountability have got to be brought back onto this issue. The culture of rights and what that means. And this has to take place through changes in all kinds of legal framework, from rights of inheritance, right to participate, right to dealing with education, and so on. The third area of gender justice is what I call distributive justice. And here, if we look at the root causes of violence and conflict, because we need to cut violence at its roots so that we don't keep walking up the down escalator. How do we bring about a less violent world so that violence do not then slip into our households, it does not create almost a sense of normality? And that means we have to look at the root causes of war, look at the root causes of conflict, and at the end of it, it is the inequalities that still exist in our world today, especially economic inequalities and exclusion. And here, the need for distributive justice is so important that because of the economics of war, why is that not everybody wants peace? It's because there are many people that still benefit from war. War is an industry. Violence is an industry. And until we get that, we're not going to dismantle the inequalities that still exist in our world and the power relationships which exist in our world today. So it is quite a challenge because it means dealing with economic security and rights, not just in terms of quick impact projects or projects and programs for women, but looking at economic strategies nationally and globally and regionally in the context of the kind of globalization that we are bringing about. And I just want to end very quickly by saying what we accept in situation of war is nothing more than the deepening of what we accept in situation of peace. And therefore, it is so important that we deal with the kinds of violence that we see on an everyday basis, the violence in our homes, violence because of the economic need, and therefore women are work as migrants and are being trafficked as domestic workers, as illegal workers. The whole issue of the way what people still call traditional practices, but it's not really. It's just harmful practices that still exist in our everyday lives. And also, how do we make sure that our institutions are held accountable in the area of prevention? How do we bring the men in as partners? How do we mobilize? Because we can't do this alone. It has to be community, and it has to be really the partnership of all. Because we know through the work on the Trust Fund to End Violence Against Women, if there's one thing we've learned is that ending violence against women has to take place at a multiplicity of levels and in multiple sectors simultaneously, and it has to address the root cause of women's inequalities, the exclusion economically, politically, and socially, and that until we do that, it is not going to happen. And we need to also to create a gender-sensitive approach to our criminal justice system. And we need to make sure that the rule of law works for women, and that women define and shape what the culture of the rule of law looks like, and what these institutions look like. So what I'm saying is that we are the shapers of our own culture, and we, at the end of the day, have to seize the moment, or else the moment will seize us. I thank you.
Thank you to Mahnaz and to Women's Learning Partnership for the invitation. And after having been almost a year at UNFPA now, I'm very glad of this opportunity to reconnect with the women's movement after being in a big UN bureaucracy. So, my brief this morning is to help set the frame, which in fact Mahnaz has already started doing, for a discussion of how we deal with notions of culture, dominant culture, complexity, change, social conservatism, extremism, fundamentalisms, and what we might be able to do about it. So bear with me if it doesn't sound like I'm talking directly about violence against women. It's in a way of the tools that we can use for dealing with the accusations that we very often get as women, especially in Muslim societies, but also elsewhere, that whenever we are fighting for the rights of women, including the right to be free of violence, that we are anti our religion, anti our culture, anti our community. Okay. I'm going to start with two quotations. One is a joint quotation, but one is also from a man, I'm afraid. First, culture is the whole complex of distinctive spiritual, material, intellectual, and emotional features that characterize a group or a society, and it includes creative expressions, community practices, and material or built forms. And that's from Our Creative Diversity, which is a UN Commission on Culture and Development. And clearly, if you take that definition of culture, religious belief and expression is one facet of a whole series of possible cultural forms and expressions and beliefs. My second quotation is from Wole Soyinka, who's a Nigerian author, Nobel laureate. And he says, culture is a matrix of infinite possibilities and choices. From within the same cultural matrix, we can extract arguments and strategies for the degradation and for the ennoblement of our species, for its enslavement or for its liberation, for suppression of productive potential or for its enhancement. And I just want to hold those two in mind as I go through. So basically, culture is complex and multifaceted. but that every culture, every society has a series of what used to be called dominant ideologies or dominant cultures. And those are the ones that support the status quo. They're the ones that support the people who are in power at the present, okay, because if they didn't, they wouldn't very often they wouldn't stay in power. So what they try to do is to ensure that that dominant culture, the dominant series of beliefs, ideologies, religious expressions are agreed to by most people and believed in as, the natural order of things. This is how things are. Or that if they critique them, they critique abuses, but not the major framework. Or perhaps to disagree but think that there's no alternative. What can we do about it? Okay. But at the same time, we also have to recognize that as well as the dominant cultures, there are also always subordinate or subaltern or alternative cultures within the same cultural matrices. And those might come from oppressed groups like women who want to change the current reality, and which have their own reality that shows that what dominant culture says cannot be true. Dominant culture says that women are valorized by cultures of honor, and women are saying, yes, but we're being beaten and killed and prevented from going to school or from working or from marrying people of our own choice. That shows up very clearly, the contradiction between their own lived experience and what the dominant culture is telling them. It may also come from people who have visions about the future and who are trying to change it. They can come from a number of different places, but there are also always these alternatives. Okay. One question then we have to deal is how then does culture, custom, religion selectively take up and develop into a particular dominant culture at any particular time in any particular society? Okay? And the crude answer is, of course, that it depends on who's doing the defining and who's doing the passing on. Who has the power to say, this is what our culture is about, not that. Well, this is what our religion is about, and not that. Let me give you one example. In terms of polygyny, the marriage of a man to more than one woman, there are a couple of verses in the Quran that are used both for validating the marriage of a man to more than one wife and for saying, but actually, that's not what's supposed to happen. And the verses go, if you cannot, and they come in the middle of a text that is addressed to the protection of orphans and the property of orphans. And it's important to remember that. If you cannot do justice, if you fear doing justice, I'm doing a loose translation, yeah? If you fear doing justice, then marry of the women of your hand 2, 3, up to 4, but you must treat them equally. But you cannot do that, therefore it's better to marry only one. Okay, and that exact text is quoted on both sides of the, yes, the Quran gives us being men, permission to marry up to 4 wives, and no, but it very clearly says that there are conditions, and it's only if you fear that you're going to abuse somebody's property that you should do it, and it's only out of the women of your hand, which traditionally meant the people you were already responsible for economically, yeah, that you should be doing it. And therefore, in this day and age, first of all, what is clearly preferable is monogamy, and secondly, the conditions for that are no longer around. Exact same text. But in West Africa, for example, it is the former interpretation that is held to be Muslim laws, whereas in some other countries of the Muslim world, it is the second interpretation that is held to be Muslim laws. It's a question of not so much what the text is as who is doing the defining, who has the power to make their definition stick. So out of that, I just want us to take the 3 points that culture, tradition, religion are contradictory, meaning they have a lot of different possibilities within them, that they are not static, they change over time and from place to place, and that they depend on power relations, in particular historical places at particular times. So with that, I want to move on to a quick discussion of social conservatism or extremism or fundamentalisms. And I'm going to quote another man, I'm sorry. In this time of globalization, with all its advantages, the poor are the most vulnerable to having their traditions, relationships, knowledge and skills ignored and denigrated, and experiencing development with a great sense of trauma, loss and social disconnectedness. Now, the first thing I want to say, of course, is that it's not only the poor, although that the poor are often, because of the conditions and the situations in which they live, the area where it's most often easiest to feel that social disconnectedness and trauma. But if we look at, for example, Al-Qaeda, most of the leaders of Al-Qaeda are well-to-do, if not middle class, if not actually well-to-do. Okay, if you look at the American religious right, most of them are not from the poor groups. It's not only the poor, but it is around this whole conjuncture that we live in now, where we have increasingly a loss of belief in rationalism, in progress, a cynicism about capitalism, communism, nationalist promises for development, certainly for those of us who come from Africa, Asia and Latin America. And increasingly we've seen a widening of the gap between the rich and the poor, with more and more people moving in to the poor groups. And certainly, but not only, for those of us in Africa, Asia and Latin America, an increasing state abdication of responsibility for social welfare, social development, infrastructures that develop people who do not have money, power, economic resources, and which was initially going along with state repression in order to enforce particularly structural adjustment programs and the like, and later has now mutated into a kind of formal liberalism in terms of the politics, but which still does not include the taking up of state responsibilities for social welfare, for education, for including protection of violence against women frequently. And this has resulted in many parts of the world in an increased social conservatism and increased extremisms and fundamentalisms. And I think we need to remember that there is a difference between a social conservatism and fundamentalism stroke extremism. Okay, although sometimes they mutate into each other, but there is a difference between them. Okay. When people stop to have to be sure that they can continue to live where they do, with the family, with the work and manage, they very often turn to what's called a defensive identity community. And those are usually constructed as primordial and unchanging, and they're very often around ethnicity, around religion. Okay, and that, if you like, is what we would call just generally a social conservatism. Okay, but where it changes into what I call extremisms or fundamentalisms is that fundamentalisms are essentially political movements. They're political movements that are based on religious or ethnic constructions of identity and imperatives, but they are political. They usually construct one version of that imperative of a collective identity as the only true, valid, authentic one. So we have constructions of what the good Muslim woman is, or the good Hindu woman is, or the good Catholic woman is. And if you step out of that, you're automatically a bad woman or a bad person. So they use that construction in order to impose their power and authority over their constituency. And sometimes their constituency is their very small particular community, and sometimes they define their constituency as practically all of humanity. So if you're not part of their definition of humanity, you are Satan's get, as in Mahnaz's quotation. They also usually claim to be the present representatives of the true tradition, however they define it. And they often also, for those of us who are not from the global West, speak against the corrupting influence of modernity and or the West, which is very often conflated into the same thing. But they're not pre-modern. And in fact, in order to promote their objectives, they usually use all the possible modern gadgets. I mean, the number of fundamentalist websites in the world is huge. There are people who apparently have nothing else to do but to make up fatwas and stick them on the web and send you millions and millions of emails every day. So, furthermore, the vision that they construct is a selective vision. They take bits of the tradition, bits that fit them, and they construct a whole out of that. And the religious right is increasingly playing a crucial role in identity politics everywhere. And we have to recognize that the linkages amongst political religious groups and between them and between the more formal political secular right-wing groups from local to international levels, both within countries and outside them, are becoming increasingly clear. I'll just give you one very obvious example, such as when the Holy See, Syria, Qatar vote consistently on the same side in international forums, from the Cairo Conference on Population and Development in 1995 to Beijing +5 in 2000 to the current. There's the CSW draft declaration right now, which is asking for a full and global reaffirmation of Beijing and the Beijing Platform for Action, to which a certain government, not a million miles from here, is trying to put an amendment to place constraints on that full reaffirmation, and which is being supported specifically by Qatar and by the Holy See. Surprise, surprise. So, fundamentalist movements often stoke each other's fires, sometimes through collaboration, as in this example, but sometimes through confrontation. For example, in India, in the Gujarat massacre in 2000, the strengthening of the power of Hindu fundamentalists has resulted in an increasing hardening of Muslim fundamentalists in the same state. So they're in conflict, but nonetheless they're stoking fundamentalism on both sides. And the other thing that they have in common is a remarkable consistency about what they want women to be and how they see women. From the United States to Afghanistan to Austria, they have a certain number of commonalities about women, concern about what women are doing, say, and asceticism about the body, cover it up, control it. A focus in particular on women's sexuality as a source of immorality, which means that women must be controlled, and which means that women should be denied knowledge about their bodies, about sexuality, should be denied access to family planning, and other reproductive rights. They also agree on an increase in means for men to satisfy only heterosexual desires, but also a control over his women, and the reconstruction of patriarchal controls over women and their sexuality, with women constituted primarily as domestic wife and mother. Nowadays it's not usually only, but definitely primarily as wife and mother. And therefore, often an increased tolerance for violence against women, and especially for bad women who are no longer worthy of consideration. And that's not contradicted by the fact that in some groups, fundamentalist groups, religious extremist groups, you will also see claims to standing up for the rights of women, to co-opting some of the demands of the women's rights movement, within the terms of what they define to be okay, but still within those terms and defined by them. So what to do about this? Well, first of all, I think I should make the point that strategies of resistance do vary, just as the local situations in which women confront these extremisms also vary. So it's not like there's one blueprint that everybody can do in every single case. But we could say that there are three broad avenues that women, have adopted. One possibility is working solely within the terms solely from within the discourse. Let's say in the US, a Christian right discourse, or a Christian discourse, or within other countries where we come from, within Muslim discourses. But not accepting the terms of that discourse. Challenging the notion of what it is, demanding access to being able to read the texts, being able to reinterpret the texts, being able to challenge the practices that have been built on particular understandings of texts. And that's been spectacularly used, and I'm sure that Zainab will be talking about it later, by, for example, Sisters in Islam in Malaysia. Similarly, in terms of Catholic fundamentalism in Austria, there have been groups of women and men theologians in Catholic communities demanding referenda within the Catholic Church on issues around women's rights. That's one area. Another strategy is working within secular spaces, so that, for example, women in black in the former Yugoslavia look at the difficult work of refusing to recognize communities that have been constructed on divisory ethnic lines and working cross-boundary from those communities. Okay, many women in Algeria, for example, have been totally refusing to work within the terms of Muslim discourses and have chosen to work in a secular space. Okay. And then there is also what I call a double claim and critique strategy, which is that people draw on and negotiate both cultural religious norms, which are simultaneously local and often also transnational. We have a local, in Nigeria, for example, we have a local understanding of what Islam means, but it also draws on a transnational discourse worldwide of what Islam is, but which are always complex and multiple, but which also draws on, claims the right to claim, negotiate, critique formal national and international rights discourses. So, Nigerian national constitutions, the CEDAW, Beijing Platform for Action provisions, and so on. And women's groups have often been really creative in this process. And I would argue that recognizing the contestations in cultural practices and their continual re-imaging, that they're not static, they're constantly fought about, as well as the power relations involved within, as opposed to a static notion of culture and religion as unchangeable, monolithic, helps us also to move past the individual group dichotomy that's also set up. Because so often we are told, if we say anything, that we are anti our religious community or our ethnic community or our national community. Typically, women's rights are posed as oppositional to the family, to the community, to the society. Okay? But you can only accept those oppositions if you accept the current male-dominant constructions of cultural norms as static and unchangeable, and thereby if you legitimate the power of those who now have the authority to be able to impose their definitions. Because women are also part of the family and the community. Okay? So, all individuals are situated, all individuals are contextualized as members of families, members of gender groups, members of classes, members of ethnic groups, members of religious groups, including very often the men and the groups who claim the authority to stand out and define it for us. So, if we recognize that, what we're challenging then is not necessarily the community. What we might be challenging is the refusal of the powers in that community to accept our rights to also participate fully in the community. Okay? To accept our right to also, what we're challenging is the power of the cultural gatekeepers to define for us what the community might be. So in that respect, what we're saying is that women may well be asserting their rights to participate in defining the community and the norms of their communities, as opposed to working sometimes instead of, but sometimes also, which is also a choice, as opposed to necessarily working outside of the community or against the community. And I just give two quick examples here. One is Baobab for Women's Human Rights, which has a multi-pronged strategy in Nigeria, one area of which focuses primarily on working within Muslim communities and on challenging the nature of Muslim discourses. So citing the ways in which Muslim laws have been developed as historical, as power situated, as male dominated, and pointing out that there are alternative interpretations, some of which date hundreds of years back, as well as newer interpretations. Another prong aims at bridging community divides between and among Muslim and other communities, okay, and working on what's our common interest here, what can we do to support each other through shared understandings and critiques, objectives and strategies, and which also at the same time claims the right both to have but also to criticize where necessary the laws of the formerly secular Nigerian state, the Nigerian constitution, but also international human rights discourses. They're ours. We have a right also to develop those, as well as our own local discourses. But in all these strategies, I think there's one thing that is necessary, and that is to break silences. Because if we don't speak up about rights violations and about our rights to participate in defining, to move on, then we can't move anywhere. So with that, I leave you. Thank you.
I want to also now use the opportunity to if you could make comments, have questions, but I would love this to be an interactive dialogue, because I know that every one of you here have tremendously rich experiences to share. But I think it would be very useful to share some of your thoughts on this, but also effective strategies that have worked, and where do you think we should be going from here? Yes, could you introduce yourself and then make your comments? Yes. Yeah, you may have to turn it on, yes. The mic, yeah.
Hello? Is that better? Okay. My name is Robin Lloyd, a member of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. I'm concerned that one area of violence has not been addressed here today, and that is the war on drugs. I'm not speaking about the use of drugs themselves. I'm talking about the way in which drug trade and drug use has been criminalized and militarized, greatly increasing guns in so many communities. And frankly, I have never quite understood why women have not been more active in fighting the war on drugs and supporting the legalization of drugs. My question is to Sakena to try to understand if you could tell us, probably opium is the major source of income for most women in Afghanistan, or am I wrong that in the amount of opium grown in Afghanistan has increased a great deal since the American invasion? And I'm just wondering how that works out, what women's role is in that business and that trade. And then I'd like to also ask Noeleen about the whether UNIFEM has ever addressed this issue and taken a stand on this point.
Yeah. Thank you. We'll get a couple of questions. I saw many hands, and then we'll come to the panelists. All right, let me just go there, and then I'll come here. Yes, one.
Good morning, everybody. I'm really happy being among you. My name is Marzia Basel, and I am a former judge in Afghanistan. Presently, I am a student at George Washington University, and am representing International Association of Women Judges here. What I heard in this session, it's really the best topics that goes back to Afghanistan, especially the practical thing that we are watching nowadays in Afghanistan. And mostly, I was charmed by the speak of Ms. Noeleen while she was speaking about the treating of rule of law and the women's right. I want to find out about the specific program and plans for the women of Afghanistan regarding access to justice and treating the rule of law and giving them the chance to have the equal rights, the Islamic and Sharia rights. Because you know that the situation changed in Afghanistan, but unfortunately there are lots of problems that Afghan women are facing because of difference of culture and misinterpretation of Islamic laws in Afghanistan. I want to find out what could be done in your own perspective. I see that Afghan women as most women who have been deprived of their legal and basic human rights. So how could we tackle with this issue? I don't know if in other part of the world we can find like women who are suffering of injustice in that part of the world, which is Afghanistan. So my specific question again is that how could we address the rule of law and strengthen the women's right in Afghanistan? Thank you.
Thank you. Because there's so many hands, could I just ask people to just make their comments short so we'll take everyone? And I'll come here, don't worry. Yes.
I'm Lois Herman with the Women's UN Report Network. I'm actually not asking a question, but a call to all of you. We heard the comment about power of cultural gatekeepers. I would like to say media. is often a result of the power of cultural gatekeepers. How much do we hear about women's truths? Is it invisible, or is it contrived and reactionary? And so we have a listserv. It's considered the most active on gender in the world. Yakin is part of it, Noeleen, Women's Learning Partnership. If you will give me your email or go to our website at www.WUNRN.com. Send me your research. Send me the truth. Send me the realities of women and girls in your countries, and we will post them. We are free, we are independent, and we are for women.
Thank you. Can I have the speaker this side now? And then I'll go to the middle. Oh, somebody has to take the mic.
UNRN.
I'm actually wondering that whether those who want to ask, why don't you come out and form a line, and then we won't be wasting time passing the speaker around. Yes? Yeah, so.
Okay, hi. My name is Alexandra Prayan. I'm a Romani woman. I'm part of the delegation at the CSW. We're pejoratively known as gypsies, and I actually have come here with, requests for coalitions among Muslim women in Europe and Romani women. In lieu of the recent immigration trends and post 9/11 with the war on terrorism, a lot of European countries are cracking down on Muslims, and they're using different tactics, such as they're playing off of the feminist rhetoric of, European ideals don't condone this treatment of women. So it puts us in a difficult position as third world feminists in terms of elaborating our concerns, which are indigenous, right? Our feminist ideals are indigenous. They're not imported from the West. So it puts us in a difficult position because we face the racism from the outside, and a lot of the times it adds fuel to the racist, and it adds to the stereotyping of the violent gypsy man in our communities and the backward, primitive Muslim and gypsy cultures and religion and whatnot. So I was just wondering if there are any thoughts as to how to go about elaborating this in racist societies such as in Europe.
Thank you. Could we pass it then? Yes.
Hi, my name is Hannah Harry, and I'm actually an advocate counselor for a nonprofit battered women's agency in New York. And I have a question for Ayesha Imam, because a lot of the things you touched on culturally are things that I'm dealing with and the women I'm working with from the Muslim communities in this country. How do women work with defining their cultural identity when they're faced with the right text, if they've been so accustomed to a certain way of Islamic laws that they had to live by for so many years? Because I find a lot of women do not know how to redefine who they are once they're faced with the reality of it. And what are the strategies that you use to work with women so that they do have the courage to keep moving on and not feel like they're the ones to blame?
Could I just pass the mic over to this side now?
I'm Vibhuti Patel from NGOs called Sehat, Vacha and RAG in Mumbai. And what I wanted to focus on was the role of hate money, especially in the Gujarat riots, how the diaspora discourse and how the NRIs have contributed massively, and the use of calamity, the earthquake in Gujarat. That was the time whole infrastructure for program was created, because it was a very well-planned, thought-out thing. So I think we need to focus, because there are so many foundations all over Europe, Australia, New Zealand and America, and they are providing money to Hindu right organization. We are always obsessed about pan-Islamic identity, but the people are cashing on pan-Hindu identity also. Number one. Number two, there is a lot of polarization of opinion amongst women's movement, in the women's movement, about role of the state and whether we should collaborate with the role of the state. For example, after Bombay riots, it was a police people Mohalla committee which worked consistently for 10 years, where the retired police officers and civil society organizations worked together. And that was the time, like in 93, all policemen used to say that in uniform we are policemen, but without uniform we are Hindu, right? We are Shiv Sainik. And now the scenario has changed. And about the judiciary administration also, whether we should collaborate with them or we should just have a politics of petitioning and street fighting. Thank you.
Thank you. My question is also for Ayesha Imam. You talked about women reinterpreting the text, and I'm wondering whether that's taking place within the framework of Islamic jurisprudence, or has there been an alternative method to re-evaluate the text by coming up with an alternative methodology of Quranic exegesis? So, are they working within the Ijma Qiyas framework that has been evolved over centuries, or has there been an alternative structure put forth? Because I think that would sort of add credibility to the process. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Roxana Ayub. I work here in New York with the Muslim Organization for Domestic Violence Prevention with immigrant Muslim women. And I like what you said about accountability, about state accountability and demanding rights on many, many levels. But I still feel, because of my work, that women who demand rights, because in New York it's against the law to hit the woman, they're still somehow looked down upon, and only if it is God says don't hit your wife, then it's okay. So still women are using, particularly Muslim women, that right has to come from them, from Islam, from reinterpretation of the Quran. So they're still not taking that right as their God-given like a state right. I'm still like myself caught up in that belief. But how to encourage women to seek out these rights as their human rights, we're still caught up in it has to be a right that comes to me from my father, or a right that comes to me from religion, or God, or Muhammad. Someone has to give them that right. And how to address that, encourage the other. So thank you.
Okay. Could you answer some of the questions? Yeah. Would you like to hear some of that first? All right. Okay. All right. Because I wanted people to speak. But all right. So let's take up some of the issues. And Ayesha, could you start? Why don't you come here? No, come here.
Okay. These are sticky ones. Yeah, the media is a major cultural gatekeeper, and I've been on record before as saying that very often the way in which, in particular, the international media, for which we can usually read global northern controlled media, has often been more of a hindrance than a help in its attempts to raise issues about women's rights, because of the way, especially in Muslim countries, because of the way it does so by demonizing Islam and therefore moving people who might otherwise, in fact, be shocked by abuses and excesses into a defense of Islam, and that there is therefore definitely a need to work on media, both our own local media, which are not, paragons of worth either, but also the control of international media, including through alternative sources such as this, but also, at least for those of you living and working in the US and Europe, through such apparently boring things as going to commissions about monopoly and who's controlling the mass media in this country and in Europe, because the global north media does have such a reach. And that is one way that is, it's not very sexy, but it is a way that does really help to move away that control of international media so that it becomes more available to alternative viewpoints as well, and less likely to stereotype both women and other communities. Okay. The second thing was about Romani and Muslim women's alliances. I don't have an immediate answer, but I would suggest that it might be useful to hook up with groups like the Network of Women Living Under Muslim Laws, and I can give you the address afterwards, and Women Against Fundamentalism, because there's a lot of discussion in Europe now about bridging alliances and about working on racist issues, on women's rights issues in ways that don't make us fall into the trap of always having to defend our culture rather than also being able to critique it. Okay. How to redefine cultural identity when faced with given texts. It's a long process. It's not an immediate thing. I'm sure that Zaina will talk about, I presume you're going to talk later, about how they did it in Sisters in Islam in Malaysia. I'll talk a little bit about our experience in Nigeria with Baobab for Women's Human Rights. And it took us actually about 3 years of beginning to work with groups of women who were not, quote-unquote, redefining Islam, but who were researching Sharia laws in Nigeria and how they affect women and where did they come from and how did they develop. Okay? And in the process of doing that, one of the things that has always struck me was that we had a workshop right at the very beginning. You remember this, Cindy? And there were a number of young men also associated with the project because they read Arabic and we didn't, things like that. And at one point, I said something about an understanding of the Quran, and this young man said, "But Islam says," and there was silence in the room because nobody felt precisely that they could, even if they were uncomfortable with the conclusion, they didn't feel that they had a leg to stand on in challenging it. And 2 or 3 years down the road, after looking at the texts, researching the laws, being exposed to alternative understandings of laws and to people in other countries, but also from Muslim communities who were doing the same sort of work, this same young man a couple of years later did the same thing. He said, "But Islam says," in this case I remember it was, "women must all cover their heads." And to a woman, and including some of the other young men who were part of the project, they said, "No, it doesn't." Okay, that is one understanding, but each person has to define for themselves. Okay, so it's not like it's an immediate thing, but the major thing I think is to enable people to know that there are alternatives, and then to give them the tools with which they can start searching their alternatives. In my view, it's really important not to say, that view's wrong, and my view is correct, but to explain how that view came about and how other views can also claim legitimacy, and then say, now you decide. Okay? But, posing the alternatives and knowing that there are alternatives is really important. With response to the charity outside issue, I think that's a really important issue to be raised because it's actually not only around the diaspora sending money home. It's also, very crucially, about very often donors, international donors, bilateral donors, and even sometimes UN agencies saying, but we know that this religious group or this ethnic group is providing help to orphans or having some schools for women and so on, and not also looking at what are the kinds of the ideologies with which they're doing it. Okay, and so that sometimes this very well-meaning aid has actually leveraged into support for religious right-wing groups. Okay, so that's to say that when looking at groups that one is providing support to, it's not only a question of are they doing a good question, or are they feeding the orphans and so on. It's also a question of what's the beliefs, what's the ideologies, what are the politics with which they're doing that, because there are always alternative groups as well that can be supported, that can be helped. But tracing where the money's coming from and how it's supporting people is a really important thing to do, and I think we need to do a lot more of that, because I think often also some people have no idea what the charity they're doing to ultimately gets used to. So tracing it and supporting and exposing that enables people to see what's happening much more clearly. The role of the state, collaboration or not, I know this is really addressed to Noeleen, but I wanted to have a viewpoint on that. And that is that I think it really has to be contextual. That there are some places and some times in which working with the state is completely useless. Either they won't let you, or they'll co-opt you, or you'll just be crushed. Okay? But there are other places and times in which there might be avenues and openings, and I think that in those situations we need to push for that, because in the last analysis, surely what we're working for is that the state is a reflection of what people in society want. So in the last analysis, we're not saying, well, those of us who aren't anarchists, I mean that in the technical sense, and I'm not an anarchist in this sense, would be arguing that what we're trying to do is make the state reflect democratically and provide for those people who don't have power, who don't have authority, who don't have influence. And therefore, if there are little openings, little avenues, it's up to us to use them and push them. Okay? But in each case, we have to make an analysis of, is this that situation now, or is it not? So, women reinterpreting the text. Lots of people do it in lots of different ways. Okay? When it comes to me, myself personally, in Nigeria, when I'm talking about arguments in fiqh, when I'm pointing out that, there are whole lots of different discussions about which hadith are acceptable and which ones are not, about whether we can only go by analogy or whether we can also have reinterpretive reasoning and so on. Usually I make the point, which is perfectly true, that I am not a fiqh scholar. I am a popularizer of what other fiqh scholars have done. Okay? But at the same time, I also, and I have to confess that it's not very worthy, but it is sometimes effective, point out that my grandfather was the Grand Qadi of Kano. Okay, which, for those who don't know, is something like a cross between a bishop and a high court judge of the emirate, the old emirate of Kano. Okay, so it's very well up in Muslim laws, and that my uncle wrote a whole series of treatises on women's rights in Islam, and that most of what I know about fiqh and about women's rights in Islam came from a Sharia high court judge. Okay, which technically makes no difference at all, but helps to bring forward a degree of acceptance for what I'm saying. Okay, but lots of people do it in lots of different ways. Okay. Do I have anything else? Law versus culture. I think that brings us back to the whole question about laws are necessary, but they're only useful to the degree that people think that they reflect what they believe about how societies need to be organized. And that's why when we're both actually in Baobab, but also in terms of my present job with UNFPA, when we're working on law reform, we're also talking about the importance of doing so in culturally sensitive and context-sensitive ways, precisely so that people feel that these rights are our rights, so that they speak to both, quote-unquote, local cultures and formal legal systems. Because if they don't, you'll have what we have in Sudan, for example, where there's been a law against genital cutting, genital mutilation, since the 1940s, okay, which is almost wholly ineffective. Whereas in other places, people have started working with, using religious leaders to point out alternative understandings of Islam that say that cutting, mutilation is not a part of Islam. That in Liberia, for example, where it's not associated with Islam, but it is associated with particular ethnic groups, to point out that there are other ways of valorizing womanhood that don't need to involve taking a knife to a part of their body, and then building on that to link international discourses and formal laws. So it has to be both. Laws are necessary, but by themselves they're not nearly enough. Thank you.
I think that the question was that how the drug is being used and anything has been done that to stop it, and especially if the women are dealing with the drug and they are using the drug and to by means of economic to get some kind of economical status. First of all, I think that we are we call that a society that is completely run by men, as you all know. And yes, we are trying to change, but to say that we are going to run businesses and do those kind of business that deal with the drug for women is not in Afghanistan that popular that I know. Yes, maybe you go here and there in the villages that the men is like sort of cultivating the drug, but the women are ordered by men to take care of it. But not that woman has anything to say or anything to do with it. And that's that much I know. And what they are doing to stop the drug, yes, the government is trying to stop the drug, but it's not sufficient, because this country has been, for 27 years, the drug has been cultivated inside Afghanistan, especially during the Taliban. It has been in an amazing rate that everybody got means of economic by it, and it's not right now. It's going to be eliminate from Afghanistan so fast, and we are working toward it, but how much successful we are, I'm not sure. Thank you. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you to both of you. Let me just pick up on some of the points, and I'll come back to the people again who would like to ask questions. Just a couple of things, and very short. The issue of drugs. The best answer that I can give is the experience that I had when I was asked to visit Ciudad Juarez because of the murder of the 300 women who were working in the Maquila Dores. And what is very clear to me after visiting Ciudad Juarez was the fact that the violence there was actually the result of the coming together of three different kinds of networks. It was the drug network, because most of the drugs from Colombia enter the United States via Ciudad Juarez, and therefore the way the drug network got organized was extremely important. The other one was the pornography network, and people making snuff videos, basically. And the third area was the network on trafficking for migrant and illegal migration. And it is the coming together of all of this, including the fact that small arms are so available. And I don't think we can actually isolate that, because again, what we're talking about is organized crime and the culture of crime and criminality. And that in fact, in many parts of the world, organized crime have become the alternative employment structure for many people who are out to get rich quick. And that's something that we need to address very seriously when we try to understand what is happening to a world that is getting to be more and more violent. I don't want to talk too much, but maybe just the one other point is the one on state. I think that the fact that you work in the United Nations means that you believe that in state accountability. But unfortunately, there are many different kinds of states. There are corrupt states, there are patriarchal states, there are accountable states, there are corporate states. But then the problem is that what do we put in place without a state structure? How do we hold, for example, the private sector accountable? We're still trying to hold the private sector accountable. So a non-state situation, I don't think it'd be much better for women, where we have seen in a situation of total state breakdown, right, of destroyed states. Who come in? It's the criminal networks who come in. Who come in would be the militias, those who control the guns, control the power. So it's extremely difficult it is a challenge to us to think of what then is the alternative. So either we hold the state accountable, have international norms and standards put in. We are working like crazy. Not that everybody, although the rhetoric is right. If you go across the street, everybody says how wonderful they have done in terms of moving the women's empowerment and human rights agenda. But then in terms of real changes on the ground, there's a lot more to be desired. But then at the same time, do we stop then and try to do something else? I think the only other thing that I would do is to create a constituency, a huge constituency of accountability to keep our states honest. And this is really having transnational networks of women, and not just of women, but also of people's movement. So in other words, there's a cost. So how do we create in this particular world of unilateral power, of all kinds of power? We need to look at how do we create alternative powers of accountability. Put it that way, using people's movement across transnational boundaries. And I think that's a big challenge for us. So let me just stop here, but I want others to speak.
Thank you very much. I've heard such exhilarating speech after speech. I almost forgot what I was going to ask. But let me just give you very small personal experience of what I'm doing. Okay, I am Kushalta Jaikar Ahmed. South Asian people will know that the first part is Hindu and the second part is Muslim. So I was married, I'm a Hindu by birth, married to a Muslim. And my personal experience came up right in the beginning when they wanted to change my name, my first name and the last name. which I fought very vigorously in the beginning, but I was told Islam says that. And what I did was I studied whatever that I could get my hands on and discovered I don't have to change my name. There is no such thing as forcing you to change your name, because by changing my first and the last name, I was going to be somebody completely different that I couldn't recognize myself. So by the time the fight became a fight, I maintained it and I won, essentially. My work, I'm a child psychiatrist, and my work contains mostly the dealing with the victims of violence, child sexual abuse, as well as the rape victims. And in that I learned about the Islamic laws and how many misinterpretations are made repeatedly. And once I'm involved now with the Domestic Harmony Committee, which deals with the rape of, or rather abuse of women, Muslim women, I'm learning more and more. So the basic point that has been made, it's extremely important that studying by yourself and being able to say, I know because I have read it, and you can tell me what Islam tells me to do without my interpretation and my reading. And I think that's the most important point I thought I should make. Thank you.
Thank you.
J'ai un grand handicap, je parle en français. Je vois que vraiment on est... Non, c'est bon. Excusez-moi parce qu'on est pénalisé et c'est très intéressant. Je m'appelle Rachida Ziyouch. Je suis journaliste algérienne en exil en France parce que menacée de mort par des intégristes fondamentalistes. Depuis 8 ans, je suis engagée dans une association qui s'appelle Femmes Solidaires en France et je travaille dans son journal Clara Magazine. Cette association regroupe des femmes d'origine sociale et culturelle très diverses, musulmanes, non musulmanes, chrétiennes, non chrétiennes, et de diverses opinions politiques. Cette association mène sur le terrain, depuis plus d'une année, une action concrète de terrain dans toutes les villes de France autour d'une thématique qui nous semble très importante, celle de la laïcité, de la mixité et de l'égalité pour les droits des femmes. C'est un travail très laborieux et très complexe parce que sur le terrain, nous sommes confrontés en France au recul des droits des femmes sur tous les plans, sur le plan social, sur le plan économique, sur le plan culturel. Alors moi, je vais en même temps faire une remarque et aussi des questions. Je trouve que les exposés ont été excellents, que cet atelier est très 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 bien. C'est vrai qu'il y a une question fondamentale qui a été soulevée, celle de l'éducation. L'éducation indispensable depuis le jeune âge des jeunes filles jusqu'à ce qu'elles soient adultes. Seulement ma question est la suivante. Je pense que l'éducation à elle seule ne suffit pas, puisque les fondamentalistes religieux, notamment les musulmans, ont en leur sein une élite intellectuelle féminine qui agit pour tout à fait d'autres objectifs. Alors l'éducation à elle seule ne suffit pas. Il me semble peut-être qu'il faudrait mettre l'accent sur quelle société nous voulons construire contre le système patriarcal avec l'égalité, la justice, et vous l'avez très très bien dit. Alors je vais être brève pour traduire. Merci.
Good morning. My name is Rachid Azouch. I'm a journalist from Algeria, and I've been living in exile in France for the past 8 years because I was threatened by fundamentalist extremists. And I work for an organization called Femmes Solidaires, and also for Clara Magazine. And this organization is an organization that is made up of women from diverse backgrounds, social, cultural backgrounds, Christians, Muslims, also various political tendencies. For the past year, our organization has been doing projects in the field in all cities throughout France, on the theme of secularism and legality of women's rights, but it's a very difficult job because we've seen recently in France that women are actually, their women's rights are suffering, and that we've been taking steps backwards in terms of women's social, economic, and cultural rights. I simply wanted to say that I have really appreciated all the speeches this morning, and I especially appreciate the fact that we've talked about education as being a very fundamental issue, and that it's essential for girls to have access to education from the time they are young girls up until they are adults. I'd like to ask a quick question, or make a comment rather, concerning education, and discuss the fact that education sometimes from a religious point of view is fueled by extremists who have their sort of core of feminine intellectuals who are fighting another cause, if you will, and who are not necessarily promoting women's rights. And we need to step back and ask ourselves, what type of society do we want to build? What type of mechanisms do we need to have in place to promote equality and justice for women?
Merci.
Thank you.
Merci. Hello, my name is Britt Keo. I'm coming from the Norwegian Afghanistan Committee's Women Board, and have been working inside Afghanistan and the Taliban just for a short period. But even Taliban was known all over the world to be the most fundamentalistic group, whatever. I think it was not that fundamentalistic that as a man which no one attacked in the same way, the Pope. Because the Pope, he don't allow birth control at all, even if people are starving to death. But the Taliban, they did not allow birth control, but they did allow birth planning. In fact, exactly the same. It was just a way of in which way they called it. It was pills available in every mother and child clinic I visited for birth planning. And we have had a war in Yugoslavia, and after that, the media has been there all the time, showing all over the world the cruelty against the women. And after that, it was demanded that the responsible persons should go to court. But in Afghanistan, as you said in the speak, it was some part of the peace negotiations to have the war criminals sitting there at a table in order to make a peace. But some Afghan friends said that if you're going to punish everyone who has done a war crime under these 27 years of war in Afghanistan, you have to punish the whole population, or very many of them, because it has been so many war crimes. But now people want justice because the same warlords are going on repeatedly asking young girls to marry, forcing them to marry, and then they jump off the rooftops the next morning because what they learned during the first night of marriage with this warlord. And this kind of thing has to stop to an end, even if it's not proper to go back and punish the war crimes that done in the past. They should stop doing war crimes now. And it's because of the poverty in Afghanistan, and it has been drought for many, many years. The only possible thing they can grow is a poppy, because that need not so much water than some other vegetables. So that's one of the reasons. If you shall have income not to eat, you have to grow something. And it's even worse in Afghanistan. Some people are allowing their children to go to work for other persons, or they let their small girls away because they can't give them bread anymore. And these girls are promised a marriage.
Yeah.
And these girls are then taken over the border to the tribal area in Pakistan. and also the small boys where there are slave actions.
Yeah, thank you very much for the details. We wish we had more time listening. It was extremely rich, but I'm very sure many people will address some of the issues you talked. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My name is Sarah Mehta. I work at the Human Rights Working Group at the ACLU, and I'm also an independent consultant on South Asia for 2 research institutes in Washington. One of the issues that I work predominantly on is Muslim women in India and how to create a more resonant and robust concept of rights by using religious traditions. One of the issues, and actually to go back to something that Ms. Imam said, one of the core principles behind this work is the way to get beyond a very artificially constructed dichotomy between rights on the one hand and religion, which makes it look like the state for its part supports women's rights, whereas religion does not. One of the issues, or there's 2 problems that I keep coming across in my work that I just wanted to put out and get some comments from the panel. The first, when I'm working with my colleagues who address Muslim women's education and the importance of it in instigating reform, is my concern that by just saying education, 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 that we ignore the fact that there are immediate political things that can be done by the state, and that we fall into the blame displacement game that we ourselves are saying that the state is doing, and that the absence of discussion on women's rights is a very political decision with political implications. The second problem is for both feminists and I think for well-meaning government officials that there's a desire to have a definitive liberal Islamic interpretation that we can appeal to, whereas it's not just enough, I think, to find alternative voices and alternative interpretations, which I think pretty much everyone in this room has access to and knows exist. But what do you do with them once you found them? How do you scale up these resources and make them activatable, if that's a word? And also just that we don't want to have another alternative elite that you can appeal to. The goal is to increase participation at a broader basis. So it's just some comments from any of you on what strategies are being taken by women who are both in Muslim majority and Muslim minority situations. Thank you.
I am Elahe Kulai from Iran. Nowadays I am working and teaching in University of Tehran. In last period of parliament in my country, I was working for approving SIDA. I want to mention about something that I think it is very important about talking in Islamic and Muslim countries. Which kind of interpretation of Islam we are talking about? I think many times there are many interpretation of Islamic values based on Quran and based on real Islamic teachings that can approve many good situations and many good conditions for human dignity of women and human rights of women. But in many times traditions and cultures in many backward countries, in many developing countries, are acting in the name of Islam. When I was in the parliament, in the last period of parliament, there was some obstacle in the name of Sharia, and there were some solutions in the name of Sharia. So it is very important to focus on the kind of this interpretation from Islam, and I think if we can educate women with a humanitarian interpretation of Islam, we can solve many of the problems of these countries. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Nushat Leedam. I was born in India but work in Toronto now with women from South Asia, many of them Muslim. Mahnaz, I think, talked earlier about a solidarity of global patriarchy. And one of my questions is that a lot of connections and links are not made between how, both in war and peace, this is negotiated, like all the leaders sit down together and sort of trade off women's rights, women's equality. And I think we need to bring that more to the fore, those kind of discussions and arguments, and maybe perhaps by example, so any and all of you could address that. My second question is, there's a raging debate going on in Canada now, particularly Toronto, on the Sharia. What has happened is under the Alternative Dispute Management Clause, basically Sharia is being introduced in Canada, and there are feminists on both sides of the divide, in Toronto at least, in Ontario. So there are feminists and very reactionary positions from both sides, either totally sort of demonizing Islam, or at the the other side is basically saying no to Sharia, and it's a difficult position to be in. So it would be really interesting. I mean, you all did an excellent presentation. I really enjoyed it, such a for sort of an integrated understanding of all of the issues. So I'd really like to hear from all of you in terms of a strategy of how do you sort of bridge this feminist divide, because we really don't want all the feminists not to be on the same side, but at least supporting a very progressive feminist position that everybody can live with. So it would be very interesting to come up with a strategy, here. Thank you.
Right, thank you. I think there are no more questions or comments. Are there any others? One last one. Is that it? Very quickly, and then we will have our panelists say the few last closing words.
Merci, je vais faire deux petits commentaires en français. Tu veux traduire après? Merci. Je voulais juste par rapport à ce qui a été dit à l'interprétation des textes de la charia, je crois que c'est un très très long débat et je voudrais faire deux commentaires. Je pense que ça peut être une stratégie dans un moment donné, dans une bataille politique, dans un contexte politique qui peut être intéressante. Mais on ne peut pas dire que nous allons interpréter et faire prendre par les femmes, conscience par les femmes, des textes. Je pense que ce qui est le plus utile, c'est de faire ça par l'État. En tout cas, il me semble que ça, c'est la meilleure stratégie. C'est-à-dire faire des lobbies pour que ce soit l'État, l'État qui fasse ce travail au niveau de l'école, c'est-à-dire qu'il fasse ce travail, disons, de révision, ce qu'on appelle en tout cas au Maroc, d'une nouvelle lecture, disons, de l'enseignement religieux au Maroc. Je pense que c'est quelque chose qui est très très payant. Et notre rôle en tant que société civile, en tant que réseau de femmes avec d'autres alliances, c'est de pousser les États et les politiques à faire ce travail. Parce que nous, de toute façon, on ne fait qu'ouvrir des portes, des petites portes au départ. On ouvre des portes au départ, on dit que c'est possible, mais après, c'est avec l'État qu'il faut faire ce travail. Deuxième, juste petit commentaire, par rapport à l'interprétation. On interprète par rapport à quoi? Ça, c'est une question aussi, il faut le savoir. Je crois que c'est très important. On interprète un texte, le Coran, ou les parodies prophètes, ou je ne sais pas qui encore, par rapport à quoi? Nous l'avons fait pendant des années au Maroc, en Algérie, Tunisie, en tant que réseau de femmes sur les 3 pays, mais nous avons toujours interprété par rapport aux normes et standards internationaux. C'est-à-dire que nous avons essayé d'interpréter les textes par rapport à la CEDAW et par rapport aux normes. Non, parce qu'il peut y avoir des glissements et des biais qui sont très dangereux. Donc je pense que quand on dit interprétation, on interprète par rapport à un référentiel des droits humains. Voilà.
Two short comments. First of all, when we talk about the interpretation of the Sharia, it is, of course, a huge debate. And I think that in certain situations, at certain times, it could be a good strategy, especially in certain political fights. And what I would say, though, is that it's not necessarily only the work of the women's movement, that it's best if this comes from the state. In other words, our role as women's networks and associations is to lobby the government to then try to make the changes to reform, for example, in my country, Morocco, to reform the educational system and the religious teaching in Morocco. So it's our job to open the doors, to show them the possibilities, but then to lobby the government to make the necessary changes. Second comment, in terms of interpreting Islamic law, we need to look at how we're interpreting it and in relation to what. What is the point of reference? When we talk about interpreting the Quran or the words of the Prophet, we need to see what our reference point is. For example, in the Maghreb, we've been doing this for several years, but we are usually basing ourselves on international instruments and CEDAW. So we need to look at what the reference point is.
Thank you. And one last comment, yes, from the man there, the last one.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the panelists and the chairperson for allowing me to talk. Probably I'm one of those brave men who have the daring mind to come and speak here. But I want to say that I have learned a lot, and I'm one of those who would want to learn and probably share with my other men some of the concerns of women all over the world. But I have some observations and some comments, and I want to endorse my sister from Afghanistan for the value of education. I think from what I have heard and from the experience back home, I think there is a gap between those who advocate for or advocate against violence against women or violence against women. And I think those gaps need to be narrowed down. An example of this is talking to our community people, particularly those women in rural areas. I think it is important that we understand the cultural implications for somebody outside that community to come and talk to those women. I think it's important, and that gap has to exist. Now, the participation of violence against, I strongly believe that women as well as men are involved, are perpetrators of these serious crimes. And I think those things need to be addressed by women themselves. For example, there are cases where women and mothers of children participate in sending their children for greener pastures in other places, thinking that when they go there, they would make heaven and they will bring the resources back home. I think these are crimes against women, and it is the very women that creates these relations. Finally, I thought that the issue of violence against women is a human issue. It's a human rights issue, and I expect that a man would be one of those panelists to talk about those concerns of women. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let's one last one. We are running out of time, but I'll let you have the last word, and then we'll come back to the panelists very, very.
Hello, my name is Anne Stromov, and I'm a philanthropic advisor for a private consulting firm. And you made the comment about how sort of targeting women as a tactic of war truncates societies by limiting their future and their potential for rehabilitation. I think that involving children in armed conflict is equally tragic and has very similar ramifications. I was just wondering if you could comment on ways of linking the women's movement in Reconstruction to the rehabilitation of children, specifically girls, child soldiers, and other ways in which children are involved and sort of their vulnerabilities in refugee camps. Women, they have so much power and potential in Reconstruction, and I was just wondering how you can see those two movements coming together.
Thank you. All right. So let me pass it over to the panelists, and there you see the negotiation that is going on. Sakena, would you start? Would you? Yeah. Okay, all right. So, Ayesha.
I think that the comments that were made about education, both as potentially liberatory but not necessarily so, are absolutely spot on. I think that what we bear in mind as a practical issue, though, is that if we know how to read, even if the stuff that we're given to read is all religious right-wing to start with, it at least keeps open the possibility that one can then read other stuff. So yes, education is important with all its limitations, but if we really want it to work, then what we're talking about, I think, is teaching people about how to think, as opposed to telling them what to think. Okay, and that does mean a reorganization of most of our country's educational systems. Okay. The second question was about, let me think, the use of, we'll get to it in terms of education as a means of putting off dealing with immediate issues. And what can I say? I agree with you. There are immediate political issues about what are women's rights, about integrating women's concerns in macroeconomic policies, in the MDG strategies, in the poverty reduction strategies, in laws for protecting women that are just not taken on board. While people say if you were listening to any of the plenaries yesterday, the problem is we have all these cultural and traditional obstacles. But there are things that can be done straight away and which aren't being done, and we have to lobby for that. We have to say, yes, we're going to work on enabling people to use culture, tradition, religion as resources rather than obstacles. But in the meantime, there's stuff you can do right now. Please do it. Okay. What kinds of interpretations and traditions and cultures in the name of Islam? I mean, I think that we all know that whether it's Islam or any other religion, or whether it's in the name of Hausa culture, in my particular example, or I don't know, Hindu culture or something, that there are lots of things done that are done in the name of those cultures, traditions, because those concepts have legitimacy. And I think they have particular legitimacy from those of us from parts of the world who've been subject for many years, decades and sometimes centuries, to imperialism, okay, or to colonialization, because at least this bit is ours. And I think that we forget two things. One is that the definition of what we now know as tradition, religion and culture has changed over time, and very often it has changed in collusion of male patriarchy and colonial patriarchies in ways that would not have been recognized prior to colonial times, and therefore built on the worst bits of both. Okay. But secondly, that it doesn't matter in whose name injustice is being perpetrated, we need to be able to fight it. Okay. And I think that brings us back to the other point about whether there is one liberal alternative and vis-a-vis one retrograde alternative. And I think to do that simply means that it is a mistake. I think because what that does, it simply means that we set up as oppositions their version and our version, and then each of us fights for the truth of our own version, which is exactly the strategy that the religious right does. I think that what we have to do very much more is make available the alternatives, the reasonings behind those alternatives, interpretations, and then say, I mean, and in my particular religious idiom, that each of us goes before Allah alone on the day of judgment. Therefore, each of us must make that choice in the light of our own conscience, and leave it at that, and trust to people's good judgment, having made possible the alternatives, the tools, the knowledge on which they can make those judgments. Thank you.
I think that this discussion was wonderful, but I would like to say something about education. That we are talking that are we saying education, and how we are going to implement this, that will have a best effect. I think that creativity here is very important, and that when you make the education as a priority, the same time you must be able to implement a kind of educational system that bring a lot of question and answer to the ground. Once you have an educational system that is implement that bring a lot of question, teach the children or teach the women how to think, how to ask question, that's itself, it means that you are raising awareness, because they learn how to ask question, and this is very important. In our society, we don't ask question, and that's the educational system that we go about it, to teach how to ask question, and then also to teach how to brainstorm the question, to get the things, the answer from the public, from the community, according to the culture and the tradition. Once you ask question and you hear their voices, listen good, and then implement those questions that you get from them back again, and the result will be wonderful. I think that through the experience, I can say that educational will bring a lot of change. Sometimes we say we do not talk about politics and we are not politicians, but really educational system, if is implemented in the right way to bring question on the table, it is awareness and it bring politics. And that means that the state will be able to do something because the people ask question, and we have to handle it to the state, because if we want to have a powerful change, we must give it to the state bring the law, because me and you as an individual could not bring that law, and the law must to come from the state, and the state must listen. And if we all raise question and we become aware of our rights, the state will do something about it, and that's I have to say. And in interpretation of Quran, I think that, again, creativity something has to do with it a lot. Yes, Quran says that, or any religion, all the religious group, they are fundamentalists. All they have something to say to stop people from getting ahead, especially women and children and women and girls. So how we interpret Quran and how to interpret other texts, Bible, I don't know, Torah or whatever, we want to interpret them if we have the knowledge of it. As Ayesha said, we are not a scholar to interpret it, but we could search for the scholar. We could look it for the scholar to bring those texts and interpretation in a right way that we can use it and as a right skillful things to provide to the society. But we can be activists, we can do research, we can communicate with each other and link with each other that we bring those changes. But that's my suggestion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, Ayesha has a very, very good point that she wants to say, and she wants you to say it, but she should hear this in her own voice. Ayesha, come.
No, I just wanted to address the question the gentleman raised over there, which is that I think that we need to, and most of us do probably, recognize that in fact violence against women and gender-based violence is not necessarily physically perpetrated always by men or by boys. It can also be perpetrated by women as mothers-in-laws, as mothers, but that there are two things that we need to remember. One is the issue of making hard choices in difficult situations, which applies to men as it does to women. Okay, but the other is the situation of the system within which and the values which this perpetrates, and those are male patriarchal values. Okay, so whoever physically does it, the point is that we have to change a male patriarchal system that validates, encourages and tolerates violence against women or against children or against men for that matter. Thank you.
I think this has been an extremely rich morning session. I just want to make 3 points. One is that we have to stop seeing culture as static, right? As a fixed, something that is fixed. Culture, like everything else, is organic. It has its own life. The fact that you introduce education itself brings about a cultural change, right? And therefore one needs to understand culture as really a dynamic process, and it's not codified in time, nor in interpretation, nor in space, basically. And one needs to really have a much broader view, including even in terms of the practice of a particular culture at a particular time. The diversity is so wide, and what usually happens is that we take the extreme interpretation or the extreme practice and then try to then put that in the center and take that as a norm. And I think we need to show that in fact there are different ways of living. Even us, I mean, you look at us, just in one room, the diversity in the way we understand rights, how we live these rights and so on. So in the same way is to allow that kind of human space. The second issue that I want to say is that we are living in a globalized transnational world, and we have to use that to our advantage. And there is the information technology that is available to allow us to break through borders and so on. And there are many effective strategies and networks that live outside of state boundaries, basically. And therefore, there are new ways of identifying ourselves as communities of change, of communities of transformation. One very good example is actually, and my friend Zaya is here, but there were in the year 1999, we had an electronic network, UNIFEM, that when we were organizing a major conference on sharing effective strategies that work on ending violence against women in the General Assembly. But 2,500 people participated, and at that time, Turkey was struggling in parliament with the passing of its domestic violence law, and there was it was caught up through a group of parliamentarians that really tried to block it, but they put their struggle out onto the internet, and then people in Malaysia answered how they got the domestic violence law passed, and that was so helpful. So again, the kind of exchange in terms of strategies that have worked is extremely important. Then there was a question that was put to me regarding children in armed conflict, and I've visited so many conflict countries and helped with the DDR process, the disarmament process, the process of reintegration. And what I want to tell you is that in many countries, what I saw, experienced, is that women become the last threshold of hope before children become soldiers. And that in many of the disarmament camps that I went to, that I saw girls who became women at the age of 12, right? And therefore, in many such places, married girls, the issue of married girls or girls with children is a big issue, and therefore, I mean, we have to look at this as a totality. That and really at the end of the day we have to abolish war as a way of dealing with differences. The economics of war and the way in which we have dealt with differences and the use of violence as that. I think the challenge of the 21st century is how do we actually end violence at the practice in the context of human security, both at a global level, at a regional level, at the national level, and at the level of our everyday lives. So with that, I think the challenge is there. We have strategies, but more important, we have partnerships. The Women Learning Partnership is definitely one of the very, very wonderful spaces that we have today. So thank you very much. And before we end, I just want to say that Mahnaz has a few words, but thank you very much.
Well, for one thing, I wanted to thank Noeleen and Ayesha and Sakena for their great interventions and guidance, and also every one of you who has spoken up wonderful points. One point that I hope we will follow up in the afternoon was not addressed by anyone, and that was the question about expatriate groups from Muslim societies living in Europe and North America and other Western countries, and what is to be done with their claim to cultural diversity vis-a-vis the laws and civic regulations of the various countries in which they live. Should they become more ghettoized by having their own special laws? Should they stay out of the mainstream of development of these countries? Or how will that be negotiated? It's a very important question which faces a lot of people now, and it has reverberations back in the home countries of people as well. So let's discuss that some more when we get back after lunch this afternoon. Lunch is being served, a light lunch. Welcome to it, and let's get back together in the afternoon for the rest of the program. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahnaz.